By the time you're watching this, the federal government is probably shut down. Like, I guess maybe they've hashed out a deal, but the president is also tweeting stuff like this.
We're just a bunch of woke pieces of shit.
So speaking to you from the past, I don't feel too great about a potential deal. But what is a government shutdown anyways, and how does that even happen? Why is this one happening, and what does it mean for you and me? Well, from Battleborn Progress, this is Battleborn Bites. My name is Jacob. Let's vote on a continuing resolution. Here's a fun fact about government shutdowns. They used to not be a thing. In fact, the first ever government shutdown only goes back to 1980. But hoo boy, have they become a staple of the congressional budget process ever since. How many shutdowns there have been depends on what you define as a funding lapse. But there have been anywhere from 14 to 21 of those, including 11 that have resulted in government furloughs. More on that later. Why is this, you may ask? Well, you may or may not have heard of a little thing called separation of powers. Please bear with me.
And that's what we call checks and balances.
Okay, so since the founding, the Constitution was designed to use Congress as a check on the executive branch, mostly by giving Congress what's called the power of the purse. I think it just rolls off the tongue, right? The power of the purse. That's the power of alliteration, is what I say. Look, all spending bills have to originate in the House of Representatives, and it's ultimately Congress that gets to decide what the federal government spends its money on. But that is easier said than done, and historically Congress has ceded all kinds of power to the president. That's true of the budget, too. In 1921, Congress goes so far as to pass the Budget and Accounting Act, fully handing over the initial responsibility for budgeting to the president and requiring the executive branch to submit a yearly budget to Congress. And the more I talk about it, the more sexy this sounds. Look, this also creates something called the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, which is going to be relevant later. And over the next 50 years, presidents would semi-frequently engage in something called impoundment or impounding. It's basically just refusing to spend congressionally appropriated money on the things that Congress said. Normally, these amounts were small enough and rare enough that Congress would turn a blind eye when it happened, or at least Congress was not politically unified enough to care. But then we get to a decade called the 1970s, when things were...
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not gonna take this anymore!
Well, it was certainly a time to be alive. More specifically, a lot of stuff that happens in the late 60s and early 70s finally gives Congress a political window to take back some of the power it had given to the president. The main one, in the wake of the unmitigated disaster of the Vietnam War, was passing the War Powers Act. And this is an aside, but the War Powers Act just basically reasserts Congress's power to, declare war, one of the, things in the Constitution that Congress is allowed to do, but whatever. And look, there's this thing called an AUMF, an authorization for the use of military force. This has kind of subverted the War Powers Act, so Congress ended up giving away the power to declare war again after the fact. So Congress just loves to give itself power and then be like, wait a second, we don't want this, but why would we have this power? But maybe lesser known is the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. Say that 5 times fast. You see, in the early 70s, President Richard Nixon starts impounding a lot of money. So much so that Congress went out of its way to create the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, and a host of new legislative mechanisms that would let Congress craft a budget outside the influence of the president and challenge those pesky impoundments. Nixon, completely defanged in 1974 by the Watergate scandal and only a month away from his resignation at this point, had no choice but to sign the thing. But in doing so, he also ushered in an era of what we can call unintended congressional consequences. Because under the new framework, Congress needs to pass 12 spending bills by October 1st, the beginning of the new government fiscal year. According to an analysis by the New York Times, Congress has managed to do this 5 times total since 1974. That's the system working. It's hard at work. Separately, a funny thing happens in 1980 under President Jimmy Carter. See, even under the early dysfunction of the CBA, this is a Congressional Budget Act, if Congress didn't finish spending bills on time, there was still an assumption that agency operations could continue until Congress eventually figured it out and passed the spending bills. But Carter's Attorney General, giving the president routine advice on this, says actually it's probably the case that legally agencies should probably shut down everything but the most essential services if there's a funding lapse. Thus, the government shutdown is born. Early shutdowns are still relatively tame by modern standards, though. They usually lasted like a day or two and costed like a couple $1,000,000. Some of them are even extremely strange. Take, for instance, 1982, when the government shut down because key members of Congress were, literally no joke, at a barbecue with Ronald Reagan and at a political fundraising dinner. So file that one under oopsie daisy. Things start getting more explicitly partisan in 1987, when congressional Democrats forced a one-day shutdown to create pressure over two things. One was the Iran-Contra scandal. That was when the Reagan administration was funneling weapons to fund the Contras, a rebel group in Nicaragua, and the repeal of the FCC's Fairness Doctrine. We talked about that one last week. In 1995, congressional Republicans shut down the government twice, both over disputes with President Bill Clinton over tax policy and budget balancing debates. For a long time, that was the longest ever shutdown at 21 days, and not for nothing, eventually Clinton did balance the budget. Also, researching this, I found this image, which just, wow. The optimism of the 90s may never be matched again. Then, two shutdowns you may remember. In 2013, Republicans shut down the government again under Obama, this time as a protest of the Affordable Care Act, which, of course, they called Obamacare, which was also passed 3 years before then, but don't worry about the dates here. That one ended after 16 days, and notably did not get rid of the Affordable Care Act. Finally, the freshest one also happens to be the longest. When congressional Democrats shut down the government for 34 days in 2018 and 2019, mostly over disagreements between Trump and Democrats over how much money should have gone to the border wall versus other border enforcement. But while the border wall started the shutdown, it was actually the economic consequences of the shutdown that eventually ended it. By the end, top White House advisors were warning that a prolonged shutdown would erase GDP growth through the beginning of 2019. Separately, a shortage of air traffic controllers was grinding travel to a halt at major airports across the country, even when as few as 10 air traffic controllers decided to stay home. Well, if that's the history, though, why does this shutdown feel so different? So at the time of this recording, the government is officially shut down. So by now you know that the government shut down on Wednesday, October 1st, which was the official deadline for all these funding bills. And wouldn't you know, no funding bills. And just to say it straight, this shutdown is kind of all over the place. To start, the long and short of it is that congressional Democrats have just enough votes in the Senate to block spending packages. They're doing that now in order to force Republicans back to the negotiating table on something called the Affordable Care Act Enhanced Premium Tax Credit, which is what it sounds like. These tax credits were introduced in 2021 in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and stretched all the way through 2025. But the gist is that they increased financial assistance for anyone getting their health care through the ACA marketplace. Essentially, because the ACA caps how much enrollees pay for health insurance premiums based on how much they make in income, this tax credit covers the remainder. But you may remember the so-called Big Beautiful Bill. Well, as part of that, Republicans needed to find ways to cut literally trillions of dollars to fund tax giveaways to corporations and billionaires, as it turned out. And one of the easiest ways to do that was in healthcare, and one of those ways was eliminating the ACA premium tax credit. Now, people all across the country are getting emails that they are possibly eligible for the worst double whammy possible, being on the hook for both losing the entire tax credit and paying for the rising premium, according to KFF. It's an issue that completely split congressional Republicans, who still weren't sure what their negotiating line on tax subsidies should be just hours before the shutdown, even as Trump himself seemed more open to a deal with Democrats on healthcare, though this was before whatever this is.
There's no way to sugarcoat it. Nobody likes Democrats anymore. We have no voters left because of all of our woke trans bullshit. Not even black people want to vote for us anymore. Even Latinos hate us.
The art of the deal is being racist with AI, I guess. Instead, the Republican negotiating line has seemed to revolve around, we're going to make this as painful as possible for as many people as possible to make the Democrats blink. Case in point, the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, which is run by Project 2025 author Russell Vogt, by the way.
You all know Russell Vogt. He's become very popular recently.
Has promised mass firings of federal workers, a compounding of the Doge-led firings from earlier this year. Trump on Tuesday threatened to cut programs too, repeating false claims that Democrats are shutting down the government to give health care to undocumented immigrants, which I have to say is just not true. By law, undocumented immigrants are excluded from Medicare, the ACA marketplace, and Medicaid. Like today, if you're an immigrant who wanted to sign up for Medicaid, the state that you're in has to verify your immigration status through the Department of Homeland Security. theory. But as they say, never let the facts get in the way of a good stump speech or tweet or things of that nature.
We can do things during the shutdown that are irreversible.
For now, it's unclear how long this shutdown could last. But even if the Trump administration does go through with plans for more rounds of mass firings, whether or not those firings stand up in court is a separate question. We're still seeing court rulings over firings from this spring, from the Doge days, so expect any litigation to stretch well into next year. But in Nevada, and in Las Vegas in particular, a shutdown would not feel amazing. Though Nevada has fewer federal workers than other states, the big risk is to travel. Remember, the 2019 shutdown ended in large part over concerns that airport services were degrading. Well, through 2025, Nevada has continued to see reduced passenger volume through Harry Reid International in Las Vegas, down another 6% in August and 4.5% over the whole year. This has led to no shortage of headlines over whether or not the Las Vegas economy is a canary in a coal mine. But on the flip side, I am no economist, but soaring health insurance costs is also not generally considered economically good or cool. So we're really entering rock-and-a-hard-place territory. It's a good thing the Trump administration has threatened to stop releasing economic data if the government shuts down. Oh wait. But that does it for today's episode. If you like the show, be sure to like or subscribe so you're the first to know when we upload a new episode. Until then, for Battleborn Progress, this has been Battleborn Bites. We'll see you next week.